Callisto Protocol isn't quite Dead Space. It's more like Dead Moon, straight from the script itself.
You know they call Callisto the Dead Moon.
Regardless of what it decides to call itself, Callisto Protocol is a solid survival horror experience, one of the closest examples of good old guts and gore action that I used to know that I've seen in the last few years. To start with, I have two disclaimers. The first one is I got to play Callisto Protocol courtesy of the developers Striking Distance Studios and the publisher Krafton. I wasn't expecting to get a review key from them, but I'm grateful for it, especially since I did enjoy the game, and I'm always pleased to be able to say when I get free access from a developer, even though that doesn't influence my opinion on how I see things. The second disclaimer I have is that I played Callisto Protocol with only one hand. That is because I had one hand on my controller and one hand on my head, scratching my head wondering what all the noise about the dodge system was about. People had said in their reviews and on Twitter that the dodging in Callisto was troublesome, which is a completely unfair criticism because it just isn't true, as the dodging indicators are clear as day and smooth to operate. No doubt this kind of bad press has impacted perceptions about the game, because after hearing this even I wasn't sure if Callisto would be worth skipping or not. Thankfully I've got to see for myself how things are, and they're just fine. Without trying to invoke the skill issue joke, I do think that these people were either bad at the game or perhaps playing it fundamentally wrong. I had absolutely zero issue with the dodge mechanic in Callisto Protocol, getting the gist of it after just my first enemy encounter, and I started stringing together perfect dodges in my sleep shortly after. If anything, dodging in Callisto might be too generous, because compared to a game like Sifu, which has a similar dodge system that I somewhat struggled with, just holding or even tapping the movement stick will ensure that you weave in and out of attacks to safely land counter combos of your own. On the other hand, if for some reason you fail to swipe left or right, you will most likely take a big hit and need to restart from a checkpoint. So I'd say it's a balanced system. I almost never failed a dodge unless I was so overwhelmed by enemies that I just couldn't see when to move. But an interesting thing about this is that the enemies themselves are also very generous. They're kind enough to take turns and not attack you when you are currently engaged in getting your pound of flesh. Enemies will even swing wildly or spit projectiles, hitting other enemies in the crossfire, inflicting significant damage on their own bad guys, meaning you can stay in the pocket at close quarters and keep a steady rhythm of flow state. This keeps the action and tension at a high in almost every encounter. The key to dodging perfectly and efficiently in Callisto Protocol is to find the rhythm in between or just after the enemy strikes. You and these alien creatures are dance partners, and like a good dance partner, you don't just step on their toes, you stomp on them and smash them. But if you try to press the issue too much, you can die in just one or two hits from greed or impatience. There's even a little poster in the game that hints that the best offense is defense. Sticking to this philosophy, I had a pretty easy time in Callisto. I should point out that I played the entire game on maximum security and I platinumed the game in less than 24 hours in real life. The one thing I'll point out about Callisto is that even though it is a survival game and follows the core ideas of that genre pretty closely, there are plentiful checkpoints, autosaves, and manual saves that ensure dying doesn't come with grave penalties. Personally, I don't mind this. It is a user-friendly game, so you can get in, get the achievements, and get out. But it's not exactly setting a new bar for challenging survival difficulty. I think in this aspect, they played it a little safe. There are a few accessibility settings that appear to offer an easier experience dodging and aiming, but I never felt the need to use those. And yes, the primary combat mechanic is centered on dodging, which some people may find repetitive, but I found it to be satisfying to do the matrix right in front of these extraterrestrial demons and counter with a well-timed swing of a bat. I really felt that Callisto Protocol was a baseball simulator and that it was prepping me for the MLB with all the swinging I was doing. This gameplay loop is enjoyable in my opinion, and there is a degree of variation to this style of dismemberment, depending on how you choose to play. Callisto is a third-person game, but it's not quite a shooter. The vast majority of the time spent fighting is through melee combat, but there are some basic firearms that you can use as well, such as to fire a finishing touch after a bat combo, which can send a limb flying off and severely nerf the following attack pattern of the enemy. Enemies will sometimes switch up their combo, swinging 1, 2, or even 3 times in succession, which can catch you off guard if you're too hasty. But with each severed arm, you typically remove one of their swings from the combo, making the fight easier to manage so you can close in on the kill. You can even use telekinesis to grab enemies towards you and toss them into gears and spike traps, which can break up the monotony of meat tenderizing or save you from wasting too much of your precious ammo. Supplies are limited in Callisto Protocol, but there's typically enough ammo, health items, and currency to go around over the course of a single playthrough. I decided to be conservative and keep my ammo for when I really needed it, especially since the bosses decide to sponge and cannot practically be fought using melee. There are weapon upgrades that increase the basic stats as well as providing some new techniques, and inventory management is important because you can only hold a few items at a time. The game's HUD is minimalist, with no map at all, health and ammo indicators shown only on the body of the player and the weapon, and item drops coming by way of stomping on dead corpses. This is a nice detail and a good way of keeping immersion by not littering drops on the ground everywhere, and I had to remind myself to scavenge the bodies for rewards after killing them. Another criticism that I think is overstated is that the level design in Callisto reduces it to a linear corridor shooter. Callisto is a relatively straightforward game by design, but it's not as on the rails as most generic games are these days. There is no map or compass telling you exactly where to go, and there are plenty of side rooms to check out that sometimes disorient you from the main path. Fighting is often claustrophobic, and there are always more enemies around a corner to keep you engaged. Though there is a lack of enemy variety for the most part, they do keep Callisto stocked with monsters to keep you busy, and they even change the rules as you gradually progress, bringing in mutated enemies that you have to stop from transforming by shooting out those tentacles just in time. Callisto Protocol reminds me favorably of Resident Evil 7, a game that was very short in length and tightly spaced and paced. There was also a lack of enemy variety in that game, but it still got tons of praise for its horror, comedy, and tension. I would estimate that there is at least 25 times as many enemies in Callisto as in RE7, and that it feels much more like a survival game than Resident Evil Village. Though I think in the scares department, Resident Evil has Callisto's number. What Callisto does have is tension and pace, and gore of course. And there are a couple of sections that are difficult and do require strategizing and micromanaging. The story of Callisto has been told before. A guy crash lands in an unfamiliar place, meets some strange people, and starts to see some strange visions, slowly unraveling his sense of self and his own morality. The facial capture is very lifelike, and the actors, including Hollywood notable Josh Duhamel, give good performances and good reactions. The main character, Jacob Lee, who could have just as well been named Josh for good measure, seems like a guy to root for when the other cast members have questionable motives. Escaping captivity and the horrors of human experimentation are enough to make Jacob, Elias, and Danny interesting characters in a plot that has been recycled. I thought the ending of Callisto was a satisfying conclusion, even though it ends on a bit of a cliffhanger, perhaps opening up the game to a potential sequel. The game's performance was very smooth on the PlayStation 5, with almost no loading times in between deaths or the starts of new areas. If I died, I'd be back in action no more than typically 1 or 2 seconds later. There were a couple of technical issues, such as some of the dialogue either not loading or skipping part of the cutscene, and one instance of an item drop from a boss glitching out, but this only happens seldom near the end of the game. The game's gore is tamer than I figured it would be, and is mostly in good taste. I suppose it's a testament to how violent the game is that a good number of YouTube videos have been age restricted, and perhaps this one will too, but I believe in showing the full picture. There's even a feature for skipping the death animation for those that are too queasy or have seen enough of them, which is a nice feature. The cleanest death I had was here, and I probably won't show too many of the really nasty ones, but there's not too many that are that bad. There's no denying that Callisto is rather bare bones, particularly without a New Game Plus at launch. While I do not want to single out Callisto for lacking this feature, especially when the critical darling, the gigantic budgeted God of War Ragnarok, also lacks this essential even 2 months after release, as did the 2018 game, not having New Game Plus is unacceptable, as replay value is a big aspect of any game's design quality. There's simply no excuse for a modern game made with state-of-the-art hardware to lack a New Game Plus mode. Perhaps there is some logistical reason for it not being included, but the criticism remains. For only a 10 to 15 hour game, Callisto could have definitely benefited from a New Game Plus, especially for speedrunners and those that would either want an additional challenge or to carry their unlocks into a new mode. The game has a good design and would have had more replay value if this was present. I personally like games to be shorter and more engaging. I platinumed Callisto in one playthrough and almost in one sitting. It was easier than I expected it to be, but I think the devs wanted players to focus more on the gameplay experience than in doing too many random challenges. That's the type of thoroughness that makes for good game design, not padding the runtime of games with pointless collectibles and repetitive side content. Callisto gets right to the point and stays on track, like the old games used to do, like the best of them used to do. As I got Callisto Protocol absolutely free, I don't want to say whether or not it's worth $70. What I will say bluntly is that no game should be $70, but I feel that this new gaming policy is more so the fault of major publishers like Sony overcharging their customers for often bloated and excessive content. All I can say is what I've said. Callisto keeps it short, but there's good value in that time spent with it. The highest score I can give Callisto Protocol, considering that there are, in truth, other games with similar elements that came before it, and the fact that it lacks an important New Game Plus feature, at least for the time being, is a 7 out of 10, for what I think is the fine and respectable game that it is. There are some people that might have wanted more from Callisto Protocol, but compared to other games that claim to be in the same genre, such as The Last of Us for example, sometimes less is more. Callisto did a decent job at following the protocol of what a survival game should be.